It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer-Kent.
And I'm Rob Farrett. PFAS chemicals have been a growing concern in Wisconsin, with high levels found in groundwater and drinking water in many communities.
New research is tackling another question: are these forever chemicals showing up in people? A new study looked at the levels of PFAS in the blood of over 600 adults in Wisconsin.
These substances have been linked to cancer, changes in metabolism, and lower birth weight, among other complications.
The researchers were unable to make a direct cause and effect relationships, but the study did find out who is more likely to have higher PFAS levels, and that two foods in particular are linked to higher levels of the chemicals in a person's blood.
Amy Schultz is a researcher and co-author for that study, recently published in the Journal of Environmental Research. She's an epidemiology senior data scientist with the Real World Evidence to Advance Community Health, or REACH program, at UW's School of Medicine and Public Health. Amy, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Yes, happy to be here.
First of all, can you talk about the importance of trying to figure out, okay, is this PFAS that we know is in water in many places in Wisconsin is ending up in us?
Yeah, well, it's important for us to understand a baseline of prevalence of PFAS exposure. You know, how many people have detectable levels? What's the dose of exposure? How high are those levels? It enables us to continue to do research. You know, it lets us know, are there subpopulations that may be more exposed that we previously were unaware of outside of known contamination sites or areas of concern? And then it allows us to compare prevalence of PFAS exposure in a general Wisconsin adult sample to a national population. You know, are Wisconsinites more or less exposed to PFAS?
We're going to look at those results and see, who seem to have more PFAS in their blood, what things might be linked at it. Before we do that, I want to put a little asterisk on it, Amy. If I'm reading your research right, we're not seeing something where people should be alarmed about it, where if they say, oh, I eat that or I'm in that category, I should be really worried. Do I have that about right?
That's correct. This is an initial preliminary study that we used existing data. Mm-hmm. So it was an existing cohort of Wisconsin adults. They'd already provided survey data and interview data on behaviors, dietary information, demographics, and stored serum samples, blood samples, for research such as this one. But because the data we used was not specifically asked in such a way to get at all potential sources of PFAS, mm-hmm. there's potential associations we weren't able to uncover, and more research is needed to really understand the associations we did find.
Okay.
It's also important to note that this was just one point in time that we looked at PFAS exposure, and exposures change over the course of time depending on, what products and occupations people have, for instance.
With those disclaimers out of the way, what kind of things stood out to you when you compared PFAS levels in the blood of people from, as you said, different demographic groups, people who lived and ate differently?
Yeah, so in our study sample, we looked at microwave popcorn consumption frequency, dental floss use, eating locally caught fish from inland water bodies, Great Lakes area, meat consumption, vegetable intake. We also looked at whether you get drinking water from a private well versus a municipality, fast food consumption. So we looked at a variety of factors that we had information on, and we wanted to see within our study sample, how did those that have higher levels of PFAS compare to those that had lower levels? And what we found was older age males, non-Hispanic white adults, those from higher household income, and those who eat locally caught fish were more likely to have higher serum PFAS within our study sample.
So let's look at the locally caught fish. Fish are in water. Makes sense. That's where we find a lot of PFAS. When we worry about things like mercury contamination, we might end up saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't be eating these fish. Again, if I'm reading your report right, we're not there at this point. There's some higher blood level of PFAS in people eating that locally caught fish. I'm not alarmed about eating that walleye at this point.
No, you should not be alarmed for several reasons. One is the information we had on eating locally caught fish wasn't very detailed. So we weren't able to look at how many locally caught fish you eat per year and if that's related to increased dose of PFAS exposure. We didn't look at type of fish or specific water bodies or waterways. Also, I should note that, as I said earlier, it's very possible those in our study sample that eat locally caught fish are also more likely to be exposed to PFAS via another source that we weren't able to look at. For example, they may be more likely to also eat store-bought, commercially bought fish, and maybe they're getting PFAS from that source, and that's explaining the association we're seeing. I'm not saying that's true, but we just don't know. So we would need to do a follow-up study to really understand the underlying factors with these associations. Another important point is the difference in overall PFAS we found among those who eat locally caught fish and those who don't may not be clinically meaningful, meaning having a PFOS level of 5.6 parts per billion on average compared to 4.2 might not mean that you have any increased risk of an adverse health effect. So that requires additional research as well. We just don't know at this time.
Talking to Amy Schultz, epidemiologist with UW-Madison's School of Medicine and Public Health, looking at one study that tried to get at the question, is PFAS in Wisconsin water ending up in Wisconsin people? And Amy, a lot of what we're saying here points toward the challenges of studying PFAS in our bloodstreams. This is kind of an opportunistic study. This is blood that had been sampled for something else. You went back and looked at it. With what you have in hand now, what would you want to see? What would be your ideal design for more studies that could drill deeper into these questions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are several ideal next steps. One would be to dive into the trends seen in this study by gathering more specific and detailed sources of exposure information. So actually measuring PFAS in drinking water from these participants, more detailed dietary items, occupational exposure, consumer products. We didn't ask about nonstick cookware use or anything like that. Also, some of these associations, there's clear underlying factors. So higher household income itself does not give you PFAS, right? So what are the underlying factors or behaviors among those in our study sample with higher incomes that might be driving that? Also, this is a first look and provides a baseline. So now we can track changes in PFAS in the population over time. So in the next 5, 10, 15 years, do we see decreases in PFAS among our study sample? Specifically, after EPA has passed, the Environmental Protection Agency in 2024 has ruled to regulate PFAS in several ways, such as drinking water standards and manufacturing and cleanup sites. So that's another area. And then expanding the research to include more adults, so a larger study sample, more adults from diverse racial and ethnic communities in Wisconsin, and also to more geographical regions in the state. This was demographically representative largely, but there are geographical representation that could be expanded.
And that I wanted to mention geography. We know there are many places in Wisconsin, downstream, their groundwater is downstream in effect from sources, airports, manufacturing facilities that put a lot of PFAS into the environment. Would you see use in more intensive study, more sample collection from people who live in areas where we know there's a lot of PFAS in the water?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of utility in ensuring levels are going down as those sites are cleaned up, as they become regulated under the new EPA Superfund is now has 2 of the PFOS on the list to be under the cleanup sites. So I think there will be need for sampling in areas of known high exposure. The utility of doing a general sampling of PFAS prevalence among Wisconsin adults is also just to potentially understand if there are other subpopulations that stand out as having a higher exposure. We didn't see that, but we wanted to look, right? Because it's not just geography that's associated with PFAS exposure. It could be certain subpopulations or demographics that are exposed at higher levels because of different behaviors. Maybe cultural ones or consumer behaviors are different among different populations. And so we wanted to look at that as well.
Another challenge that pops in my head, and you've pointed toward this. I sometimes think PFAS is a thing. You've mentioned multiple times. There's hundreds of kinds of chemicals in these classes. Does that make it hard to test for all these different types of chemicals? Do we have tests that can test for lots of things, or are we doing them kind of one at a time?
That's a great question. PFAS exposure and the health effects associated with PFAS exposure are very difficult to specify for many reasons. There are actually at least 5,000 PFAS compounds, and they have varying toxicity levels, potentially varying health effects. And you're right in that most studies to date have focused on a limited number of better known PFAS compounds. And that's largely because it's very expensive to test and to develop assays and tests to actually measure these in different analytes. So, like different mediums. So in blood versus in a food product or household dust or in water. So it's quite costly. And to get a large enough human study sample to donate blood, for instance, is also quite costly. There are potential findings from the study that are informative in that one thing I haven't mentioned is that while over 96% of Wisconsin adults in our study sample had detectable levels for 6 PFAS compounds, for 8 of the PFAS compounds, no one in the study sample had detectable levels. And for an additional 9 PFAS compounds we looked at, fewer than 10 people had detectable levels. So there are PFAS compounds that either the half-life is short and they're not remaining in the body for very long, or exposure is very limited or very sparse, and it's not in a lot of consumer products.
And Amy, we'll leave it there. That's Amy Schultz, epidemiology senior data scientist with the Real World Evidence to Advance Community Health, or REACH program at the UW School of Medicine and Public Health, talking about efforts to track PFAS in our bloodstreams.
Coming up on Wisconsin Today, the city-owned zoo in Chippewa Falls is at a crossroads after their beloved tiger Lulu died.
Yeah, it was extremely hard. She's been with us since 2010. I remember hearing stories of how Lulu and Lily, both of our tigers, got walked in on leashes.
The future of small zoos and animal exhibits, that's next on WPR News.
It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Rob Farrett.
And I'm Kate Archer-Kent. The tiger exhibit at Irvin Park Zoo in Chippewa Falls stands empty. Lulu, the white tiger, died in January, and now the zoo is down to 2 large animals, a bear and a hyena, with their structures in need of repairs.
Irvin Park, like other zoos around the country, is also at a crossroads, rethinking how it exhibits animals and the zoo's place in the community.
John Jimenez is Chippewa Falls Parks Recreation and Forestry Director, and he joins us now. John, welcome to Wisconsin Today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Give us a picture of Irvin Park Zoo, and what has it been like losing Lulu in January?
Yeah, so our Irvin Park Zoo, it's pretty amazing. We have the opportunity within our community to provide extremely important educational opportunities for the youth and adults alike. And so it being a completely free zoo for the community and surrounding communities, it's a bit unique, right? So we highly depend on donations and volunteer work for the zoo. But when you're speaking specifically of Lulu, that was a difficult process that we had to go through. And losing such a staple within our zoo and our community was definitely challenging for not only our zookeepers, obviously, who have grown close and bonding with our animals at our zoo, but for the community alike. I know a lot of people really enjoyed coming annually to visit Lulu amongst the other animals at our zoo. So yeah, it was extremely hard. She's been with us since 2010. And I remember hearing stories of how Lulu and Lily, both of our tigers, got walked in on leashes, and so you could imagine how little they were when they came in, even though they were big because they're obviously they're cats, tigers, and so yeah, they've been with us for a long time, and so it was definitely something that was difficult to go through.
So many memories during that time period. I understand Lulu's exhibit is old. It's in need of pretty big repairs. What are you considering when trying to decide if Irvin Zoo should revamp its large animal exhibits?
Our large mammal exhibits, we have three of them, two of which are currently still housing animals. We have a hyena in one of them, and then we have our black bear in the other exhibit. Both of the animals are senior animals, and so it's one of those things that having animals all come in at the same time, unfortunately, they start meeting their end near around the same time as well. And so with Lulu now not with us any longer, that exhibit, in addition to the other two, really need a lot of work, like you mentioned. They're just about 20 years old, the exhibits are. And so they've gone through a lot of wear and tear. There's fiberglass faux rock features along the exhibits on all three. And in all three, there's different damages that need to be addressed. And the last thing we want to do is to have a new animal enter the exhibit with pre-existing damages that could cause health problems to any new animal that would come into that exhibit. And so something that our park board and our zoo and our staff have really been intentional in having serious conversations around what is next, right? And so I think some of the things that we really want to focus on is kind of redeveloping those spaces to be more of a natural space for animals. And so looking at demoing that faux fixtures that are around that area so that we can really bring in more natural resources that would meet the climate and the animals that would go into those exhibits.
Are there dollar figures being tossed around? Like, what does it take to overhaul these exhibits monetarily?
So we got an initial quote from a manufacturer that deals with designing specifically for zoos, and the number came back for all three of the exhibits just over $400,000. And so obviously way more than we anticipated the number coming back in. But so we've been kind of, trying to look at alternate options and seeing what work our talented staff here within our park system and our public works team would be able to handle as far as demoing and kind of doing some of that portion of the work to see if that can at least provide us with some sort of cushion in our ability to try to allocate funds for a project like this. So outside of that initial quote, I know that we've been kind of working closely with trying to talk to different manufacturers and people that have experience with this type of design and craftsmanship. And so it's something that it's still very preliminary. Lulu passed away not too long ago. Conversations had been going on prior to that, but it really pushed us into high gear once Lulu passed away. And knowing that we really can't afford to put a new animal in that exhibit, knowing the potential hazard areas that are there. And so as far as numbers, I wish I had a more stable and fixed figure. Unfortunately, we do not, but I do anticipate it being a costly project.
What is community reaction like in the Chippewa Valley about the potential for discontinuing, a big cat exhibit?
I think it's mixed, to be honest. I know that there's a lot of people who really enjoy the ability locally to come and see some of the exotic animals that we've housed here at our zoo. Again, like I said, it's mixed. I know we have people who really would support the idea of kind of moving towards more North American animals, which in speaking to our zookeepers and our staff and just conversations we've had with the park board and just people that I've spoken with here within the city, I think it is within our best interest as a zoo to be able to focus in on North American animals and really displaying those for the community and providing continual educational opportunities to learn more about the animals and wildlife that reside here within the region and the area. So I think that's our goal and our intention moving forward. I know that it can be difficult for people who are used to seeing more exotic animals, but I think in the long run, it's something that's going to be best for the community and the animals and our zoo.
John, thank you for joining us with this update.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure.
John Jimenez is Chippewa Falls Parks, Recreation, and Forestry Director. As we learn how a local zoo is working through difficult questions, we turn now to UW-Milwaukee history professor Nigel Rothfels. A revised edition of his iconic book called Savages and Beasts was recently released. It traces the origins of the modern zoo. Nigel, welcome.
Oh, it's cool to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
As you hear the situation they're facing at Irvin Park Zoo in Chippewa Falls, what stands out to you?
Okay, well, kind of awesome in so many ways, and it's a really interesting example. I should say, right up front, I have not visited the zoo in Chippewa Falls. Kind of want to, though. And I think what you're seeing in a way is a problem that is facing a lot of, smaller municipal zoos around the country. Bigger zoos are getting bigger and more exciting, and people are, traveling further to, see the more famous zoos. And I think a lot of, very kind of local, small municipal zoos, are trying to work in that space where they are talking to their local community. It's their local community really that is the weekly visitor, and trying to figure out like where's the spot for us and what kind of collection should we have and what does our future look like. Some of these zoos, again, not talking about Chippewa Falls, but some of these zoos are actually quite old and are facing fascinating questions about like, well, what would a future look like for us?
I was struck by your sentence about how you say zoos are more for people than they are for animals. And I'm wondering if you could suss that out and discuss what you see there as people go to zoos and what you found.
I think it's it's a kind of funny expression, and it's one I've used because I think intuitively a lot of people think, well, zoos are where animals are, and they're for animals in some sort of way, but they're obviously kind of just places that we make for ourselves. They are places of recreation, places of education, places that in some cases are really committed to a conservation mission or a scientific mission. They are a creation of human culture. And as such, right, they reflect our values and they reflect where we are historically and our ambitions for ourselves and our communities.
You've long studied Karl Hagenbeck in Germany in the late 19th century, early 20th centuries, known for his work in displaying animals and zoos. How have the physical spaces of zoos and exhibits changed over time as we see a zoo in Chippewa Falls struggling with their actual exhibit and bringing it up to date?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. So, all right, so Karl Hagenbeck, I don't know, there will be people in your audience who might know the name Hagenbeck because of its connection to something called the Hagenbeck-Wallace Circus, which was active in the Midwest in the middle of the 20th century. But the name refers to this person, Karl Hagenbeck, who was born in 1844 and died in 1913. And Hagenbeck, at least in the world of zoos, is kind of most famous for developing the moat. So if you've been to a zoo and you've looked at an exhibit, and instead of like a barred exhibit, you looked across a moat and then animals in a sort of appearing natural setting, that was something that was invented at a particular point It was patented actually in 1896 in Germany, the
Wow.
moated enclosure for a zoo. And it was kind of, people refer to it as sort of the Hagenbeck Revolution, this kind of moment in zoos when animals were, in some sense, at least metaphorically, freed from cages and put into more naturalistic environments. I think you heard from John, right, that the naturalistic environments themselves, especially in the early editions, and even really in so many cases today, are, might just be made of materials that are construction materials. They're sort of, concrete and now fiberglass and things like that, but it's made to look natural. And then, there's other efforts that have been to sort of use the natural landscape itself to create exhibits. I think, John was suggesting that there are opportunities, again, depending on what kind of animals you want to display, to work with local flora, local plants, to create an exhibit that is, sort of true to the environment in interesting ways.
Is it hard for zoos to change? Because you were struck by how Hagenbeck's Animal Park, how little had changed over the course of about 100 years.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? So sometimes I think about zoos as in this kind of conundrum that kind of amusement parks are in, that they have to somehow come up with like a better ride for people all the time. It's like, how can I make that better exhibit? Because I think when people go to the zoo, somebody put it really beautifully once, that somehow zoos are always a little bit disappointing, that you go and you kind of wish it were something a little bit different. And that sort of element of zoos has been there since the development of public zoos in the 19th century. People have like had ambitions for making zoos bigger and better for the animals and better for the public. And that sort of engine has been driving the development of zoos over the years.
I wonder, what will zoos look like 20, 30, 50 years from now?
So first of all, I think it's pretty clear that there will be zoos. I think a lot of people sort of wonder, won't zoos just eventually disappear? And I don't really see any reason to think that that would happen. From as far as I can tell, as long into the past as I can go, there are records of animal collections, of unusual animals, what we might call exotic animals. And these kinds of collections are all over the world. I think that they, at some level, in our brains, somewhere hardwired, we want to have opportunities to look closely at animals and the world in ways that is not sort of every day, to bring that really exciting stuff to us. So number one, I think there will be zoos. Number two, I think that the smaller zoos are kind of slowly disappearing. And I think what you are seeing more and more is a sort of concentration of resources, financial resources, kind of more famous type zoos, larger zoos with more animals, and more unusual animals, and the idea of a local park that has a few deer in it and some bears, or some local animals like that. That we're slowly sort of moving away from that. Except I think it's also true, and I think that, the Chippewa Falls case may just be one, that there will remain kind of a sort of hyper local audience for zoos. And the tradition of like the free zoo, which still exists in lots of communities around the country, which is sponsored through donations and through sometimes some sort of tax levy. Those places, really do sort of serve a local function.
I wonder, though, will patrons of these zoos feel better about them in the future? Will we still feel a bit uncomfortable with how these wild animals are being held in captivity?
Oh, gosh. I just kind of love this question in so many ways, and forgive me for going crazy on it, but a few things. So one question in there is what a wild animal is versus what a zoo animal is.
Ah.
And I think that in many ways we talk about wild animals, but honestly, most of the animals that people see in a zoo are really well adapted to that environment. They may have been born in a zoo and have spent their lives in zoos. Honestly, sometimes I think if you took a small, like antelope straight out of Africa and dropped it in one of our contemporary zoo exhibits, it might kill itself in a few minutes because it would just run against a wall because it won't know what a wall is, right? So there's that. Whether people will continue to feel some kind of a kind of sense of discomfort at the zoo, I don't know. It's kind of hard to call. I think in so many ways, zoo design over the last 100 years especially has been about addressing that discomfort and trying to find ways to demonstrate to the public that the animals are in fact being better taken care of today than they were in the past. That is, that is a true statement. The animals do have, in most zoos today, better environments than they did, 150 years ago. And the kind of sort of veterinary care and things like that is at a completely different level. So zoos are definitely better than they used to be. And based on that, one can only assume going forward that they will continue to be, yeah, they'll continue to improve. The circumstances for the animals themselves will continue to improve because that issue of the public feeling maybe just a little uncomfortable at times will persist, and that will keep the field changing.
Nigel, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's fun, Kate.
Nigel Rothfels is a history professor at UW-Milwaukee. A revised edition of his book called Savages and Beasts, The Birth of the Modern Zoo was recently released. And earlier, we spoke with John Jimenez, Parks, Recreation, and Forestry Director for Chippewa Falls, about the role of that community's free zoo and how it plans to evolve its exhibits in the future.
Coming up, a new documentary digs into the secrets of a unique Wisconsin landscape.
Over months, the wetland started to open itself up to me, and that's when you really started to see the beauty that makes this place special.
It's the Waubesa wetlands. Meet the director up next here on Wisconsin Today. You're listening to Wisconsin Today. I'm Rob Farrett.
And I'm Kate Archer-Kent. Now it's time for Wisconsin Life. Here's producer Maureen McCullum with a story about living with grief.
Profound loss has a way of never going away. Writer Amy Fleury moves through her grief on her family's land, where she often thinks about her late son and her own mortality. She shared the following story at a live Wisconsin Life storytelling event in Eau Claire at the Lakely.
As Derek, my then fiancé, drove us across the bridge at Hudson, the piney woods we passed were etched against the gloaming sky. Once we crossed into Dunn County, I was delighted to approach, through the stands of eastern white pine, a picturesque farmstead with a cozy house that Derek's late granddad had built himself, a red barn and a couple silos. All nestled in 450 acres of the family farm, whose trees would become lumber. In the freshness of morning, we bundled up and Derek led me by my mittened hand on some of the farm's woodland trails. He loved this farm he'd been visiting since childhood. First to visit his grandparents and then his own folks who had retired there. He shared with me that he hoped to call it home one day. He and his late wife, Lisa, had even chosen to be married in Menominee. We hiked through old snow on what would have been their 15th wedding anniversary. When we came off the trail, Derek showed me the maple under which Lisa's ashes were buried. We visited the farm once more before we were married, and then it would be over 3 years before we could return. We were blessed with a son, Graham, who lived and died in a pediatric hospital in Texas, and that kept us away. 7 years later, we sold our house and made the move north. We wanted to be closer to family and to learn how to care for the tree farm as we would one day be stewards of it. The only piece of real estate we now own is a plot in Lake Menamin's Evergreen Cemetery. We purchased it in the zombified days of early grief, a time when I felt simultaneously skinless and numb after the death of our 2.5-year-old son. It's when I had not yet realized it would be acceptable to keep Graham's urn near us, that we need not yet abandon it under the pine needles and snow. A truth that dazzled me gradually was that there would be no one to visit our grave. At best, someone might pass by and wonder at the curious configuration of our dates, an almost pioneer-like starkness with the early death of a first wife, a midlife marriage, and the loss of a young child. Perhaps the better course, in the end, is for our ashes to be sifted together, a bone meal supplying nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus, spread to nourish a mighty pine, or many. Some brisk morning, a family might walk among those trees. May their joy in existing together in this place be evergreen.
Amy Fleury shared that piece, Evergreen, at a live storytelling event in Eau Claire at the Lakely. It was hosted by WPR's Wisconsin Life and the Chippewa Valley Writers Guild. To hear her full story and learn why she wanted to talk about grief on stage, go to wisconsinlife.org or check out the Wisconsin Life podcast. Wisconsin Life is a co-production of Wisconsin Public Radio and PBS Wisconsin in partnership with Wisconsin Humanities. Additional support comes from Lolan Mary Peterson of Appleton. I'm Maureen McCullum.
This is Wisconsin Today.
As a child, Milwaukee filmmaker Ben Albert would get dropped off at his grandparents' house every Friday to explore the wetlands in their southern Wisconsin backyard, where they have lived for more than 50 years.
They were just trying to open up this world to us as kids. You would go out every time we went out, there'd be something new and interesting, and we would fish for, a dip net in this creek. So you wouldn't really expect much, right? Mm-hmm. But every time we would pull it up, there'd be this just immense amount of organisms and all this life. And as a child, that was just extremely fascinating.
In a new film, his grandfather recalls Ben's fascination with the natural world from an early age.
And Benny, who was 5, said, "I know what I'm going to be when I grow up." He's such an observant person.
Oh, Grandma, I know a way how to keep a crayfish. I'm going to try not to tell you, but...
And then I said something like scuba diver, and so on. He says, "No, Grandpa, scientist. I'm going to be a scientist."
Instead of becoming a scientist, Ben eventually decided to pursue filmmaking as a career. In 2020, he rediscovered his childlike wonder for the natural world by making a documentary about the place that inspired his curiosity as a child, the Waubesa wetlands.
Ben Albert's new documentary is An Invitation to Wonder, Waubesa Wetlands. It airs on PBS Wisconsin on Sunday, March 16th at 6:30 p.m. Tells the story of the natural hidden gem just south of Madison and the scientist who aims to preserve it, Ben's grandfather, Cal DeWitt. I talked to Ben Albert last week. There's kind of three main characters in the documentary. There's you, there's the wetlands, and there's your grandfather, Cal DeWitt. He's a legendary researcher at UW's Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. His voice, his face is very prominent in this. I want to give a listen to him talking about observing the wetlands.
One thing that you learn in being a student of the wetland is patience, persistence. And that often will open the book to you so that you can read the real beauty.
And that's what you did. The heart of the documentary is you, just you, out in a boat on the wetlands week after week, day, sometimes after dark. What did you get from that? You know, you're in that first experience, but then you go back again and again. How did the wetlands kind of open up to you in your understanding when you had that patience and persistence that your grandfather's talking about there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So on first impression, a wetland is a very kind of inhospitable, challenging place to be in. And I think that's a big reason why they're so misunderstood. In Wisconsin alone, we've lost so much of our wetlands. And I think it's just that disconnect and that kind of fear people have for these places. They're these mosquito infested, they're inhospitable, it's challenging to navigate. And that was both for my grandpa and I, that is kind of some of the first impressions. You go out there and you're sinking into the peat, sometimes up to your waist. As you learn in the film, the peat extends way down below you. So there's areas that you can fall in. Vegetation is tall. Some of the cattails are over 10 feet tall. So you kind of can get lost navigating through it. And what my grandpa taught me and really encouraged me is just to go out and spend the time there and tried to kind of set aside some of our human expectations of I want to see this today, I want that to happen, because you can't really predict what's going to happen in the wetland. There's so much life, there's so many different intricate kind of systems happening all at the same time. So the key was really to go out every day, be patient, and over months, the wetland started to open itself up to me. And that's when you really started to see the beauty that makes this place special.
All that said, there were some unique challenges, it looked like, and you talk about it some in the documentary, to filming in a wetland environment. What were some of the biggest obstacles you had?
Really, a wetland is, as the name suggests, it's wet land. Everything is saturated with water. And when you're out there filming with camera equipment that is not waterproof, that poses a significant obstacle and challenge. So I learned quickly I had to tie my camera down to the canoe. I had to invent kind of some different kind of DIY camera techniques, I guess, for filming in this environment, especially for filming the underwater landscape. Which is, half of this ecosystem is under the surface. So I wanted to make sure I could capture that. And I used a fish tank that I actually was able to set my camera down in, and that allowed me to film about a foot under the surface to capture most of that world. So different kind of obstacles like that. And of course, learning later that the depth of the marsh and that you can sink in and that there are these holes, there's a very real kind of fear there that,
30-foot deep peat, up to 90 feet, I think.
Up to 95 feet in depth, the peat extends below you. And some areas of the marsh are like walking on a trampoline. There's a thin layer of vegetation on the very surface and everything below you is saturated. There's water slowly percolating through from springs deep underground. So it's almost like you're walking on the surface of a lake with a thin layer of vegetation on top.
We're talking with Milwaukee-based filmmaker Ben Albert, creator of the documentary Waubesa Wetlands, an invitation to wonder. It tells the story of the natural hidden gem just south of Madison and the scientist who aims to preserve it. I want to give a listen again to your grandfather, Cal DeWitt, talking about the complexity of this wetlands ecosystem.
And if you try to understand it, you'll discover that you have entered a system which always requires more knowledge. It doesn't stop at the bottom of the peat. It doesn't stop, period.
That's a great attitude. I think this is a situation where the more you learn, in this case about the wetlands, the more you know you don't know, kind of.
Exactly.
Did that kind of keep unfolding to you as you kept going back week after week?
Yeah, I love that section of the film and that interview. My grandpa has lived there for over 50 years, and even after spending all that time out there, he feels like he's just scratched the surface of this ecosystem. Like there's always more to learn, especially as a scientist, And one thing that's really unique and special about my grandpa's perspective is he has always had that open, childlike wonder and curiosity for the world, and that's something I think that he has gained from also being in relationship with the marsh, this place that has so much. There's always something new that you discover every time you go out there. There was a few kind of situations where I just did become very humbled by being there. For example, when you're in the fall, when there's all the migrating birds, and you see these flocks of thousands of blackbirds overhead, it's hard to not feel very small in comparison. And also going out at night, and there's all these different experiences that over time you realize that you are a guest. You're a guest entering this ecosystem that is so much bigger, so much older. We're just a part of the system. We're very small in comparison, and these places have been evolving for thousands of years.
As we wrap up, Ben, what would you say to encourage someone to pick that piece of nature, whether it's in their yard or a local park or a state park or whatever, and keep making that visit and having that patience and persistence to see what we can learn from it?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the most important lessons I learned from making this film is something my grandpa he told me, and he really lives by, and that is, in order for someone to care for and protect something, they first need to really love it. They have to love it on a very personal level. And one thing he did was, when he first moved into their home around the wetland, he was worried about it being developed. There was actually proposals of a highway being built across the marsh. And he took his neighbors on field trips into the marsh, and he also had his graduate students from UW-Madison present their research to the neighbors. And it was just, people need to see it with their own eyes. That's really how he was able to protect the Waubesa wetlands, was bringing people out there so they could build their own relationship with it and seeing the research his students were doing. And I think that applies to much beyond Waubesa wetlands as well. There really is so much to learn right in our backyards. And I would just encourage people to go out and discover what's there.
Ben, thanks so much for sharing this with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ben Albert is a filmmaker based in Milwaukee. His documentary, An Invitation to Wonder, Waubesa Wetlands, airs on PBS Wisconsin this Sunday at 6:30 p.m. You'll be able to stream it online after that broadcast at waubesafilm.com. A Wisconsin author has a new book about the impact of social media on tween girls and the ways that young girls navigate life online and their mental health.
And we want to hear from you. If you grew up with social media in your tween and teen years, what did it mean to you? What were the upsides and the downsides and the things you wish were different about it? And how did social media affect your friend groups?
And if you've raised children in the era of social media, same questions.
Share your stories, share your thoughts. Email wisconsintoday@wpr.org. That's wisconsintoday@wpr.org. Or you can call or text us at 888-642-0232.
Wisconsin Today is the work of a team of producers, hosts, and technical directors. Learn more about us at wpr.org/Wisconsin Today. I'm Rob Ferret.
And I'm Kate Archer-Kent. You're listening to WPR News.